The November wind whipped through the pine branches as Richard Donovan adjusted the brim of his Forest Service cap. After 15 years patrolling the Trinity Alps, he knew every corner of these mountains, or so he thought. The morning had started like any other on his quarterly patrol of the seasonal creeks, a protocol established after the last fires had devastated the park's eastern flank. Sector 17 checked. Water levels stable, vegetation recovering, he murmured into the voice recorder clipped to the pocket of his worn shirt. At 52, Richard preferred these traditional methods over the new apps the department kept pushing. Hidden Valley Creek was barely a thread of crystal water snaking between moss-covered rocks. This place rarely saw visitors. It was a 6-hour hike from the nearest trail and didn't appear in any guidebooks, which was precisely why the anomaly caught his eye. A cluster of stones arranged in a semicircle too perfect to be natural. Richard stopped, his brow furrowed. After decades in the forest, he'd developed a sixth sense for human intervention in the wild. Possible illegal campsite in Sector 17B, he recorded as he approached with caution. There were no traces of ash or trash, just those deliberately placed stones at the edge of the creek. He crouched, noticing the earth beneath one of the larger rocks showed signs of recent disturbance. With his calloused hands, he moved the stone aside and began to dig with the small folding shovel he always carried. 4 inches down, his fingers touched something synthetic, plastic. He carefully unearthed a tightly wrapped package. "What the hell?" he muttered to himself, wiping away the mud. Inside the clear, moisture-proof plastic was an oval silver locket engraved with a floral design. Richard held it in the light filtering through the trees. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. The ranger had seen that locket before, not in person. But its image had circulated in internal bulletins, police reports, and missing person posters. It belonged to Melissa Harrington, the college student who had vanished without a trace in these very mountains 5 years ago. With trembling hands, he pressed the small side button that opened the locket. Instead of the family photos the report said should be there, he found tiny slips of paper carefully placed in each frame, numbers and letters written with surgical precision. "Dispatch, this is Donovan." His voice sounded strangely calm as he keyed his radio. "Requesting immediate law enforcement presence at my location. Code 647. The radio crackled before a voice replied. "Donovan, confirm code 647. Evidence related to a missing person case." "Affirmative. I've found Melissa Harrington's locket." While he waited, Richard meticulously photographed the find and its exact location. As a search and rescue veteran, he knew every detail could be crucial. He looked again at the mysterious numbers inside the locket, recognizing the pattern. GPS coordinates, but encrypted in a way he couldn't decipher. The sound of his radio broke his thoughts. "Donovan, units are en route. ETA 40 minutes. Maintain a secure perimeter." He sat on a fallen log, staring at the locket in his gloved hand. 5 years ago, the Harrington case had shaken the local community. Melissa, a brilliant geology student at Stanford, had come to the Trinity Alps for a solo hike, something her friends said she did regularly. Her car was found properly parked in the designated area, her hiking permit correctly filed. She just never came back. Search teams had combed the area for weeks. Richard himself had been part of that operation, but they never found a single clue. Not her backpack, not a campsite, not a sign of an accident. It was as if the mountain had swallowed her whole. And now, 5 years later, this locket appeared, carefully buried in a place so remote that not even the most exhaustive search teams had explored it. Someone had put it here deliberately. Someone who knew these mountains very, very well. The wind shifted abruptly, carrying with it an unnatural scent. Richard stood up, the unsettling feeling of being watched creeping over him. He scanned the dense trees surrounding him, but saw only shadows dancing between the wind-whipped branches. The locket in his hand suddenly felt as heavy as a stone. Those coded coordinates were a whisper from the past, a macabre invitation to a game that had started 5 years ago. Richard Donovan didn't know it then, but he had just unlocked the first door to a labyrinth of secrets that would forever change his understanding of human nature and of the seemingly peaceful Trinity Alps. The conference room at the Alpine County Sheriff's Department had never been so crowded. Detectives, forest officers, and forensic specialists huddled around a central table where Melissa Harrington's locket rested inside a sealed evidence bag. Sheriff Marcus Bennett, a burly man with salt and pepper hair and piercing eyes, spoke, gesturing to the enlarged photographs projected on the wall. At 10:37 yesterday morning, Ranger Richard Donovan found this locket buried in a remote area of the Trinity Alps. Bennett paused, looking directly at Richard, an area that, according to our records, was checked during the initial search. Richard cleared his throat, not with the necessary thoroughness. Hidden Valley is off the usual routes, and the rainy season in '02 made that area difficult to access. Detective Claudia Ramirez, a recent transfer from San Diego, leaned forward. Can someone explain to me why this find is so significant? It's been 5 years. An uncomfortable silence filled the room until Bennett answered. Because the locket was clean, protected, and deliberately placed. That's not something nature or an animal would do. The forensics tech projected new images of the locket's interior. The original photographs were surgically removed and replaced with these codes. Our team has confirmed they are GPS coordinates modified with a basic substitution cipher. And where do they lead? Ramirez asked. To 6 different locations within the national park, the tech replied, displaying a map marked with red dots. All in remote areas, all a considerable distance from each other. Richard studied the map, recognizing each location. They were exceptionally difficult to access, some nearly impossible during certain months of the year. This isn't the work of an opportunist, he murmured. Whoever did this knows these mountains as well as I do. Sheriff Bennett nodded grimly. That's why we've officially reopened the Harrington case. And why, Donovan? I want you on the investigation team. The meeting continued with teams assigned to explore each of the coordinates. Richard was partnered with Detective Ramirez to investigate the first point, located about 10 miles from where he'd found the locket. As the others dispersed, Ramirez approached Richard. I need to understand this case from the beginning. Can we talk privately? In the empty station cafeteria, Richard recounted the events of 2002 as Ramirez took meticulous notes. Melissa was an extraordinary kid, he explained, displaying a photo on his tablet of a smiling young woman with brown hair and bright eyes. 21, geology student, loved the outdoors. She came to the Trinity Alps at least twice a year since she started college. Alone? Ramirez asked, frowning. Always. She was very independent and an extremely competent mountaineer. She registered her route, same as always, a 3-day loop on the Morrison Trail up to Mount Silent Summit. Her car was in the main lot, permit visible. When was the alarm raised? When she didn't return on the 4th day. The lot attendant noticed her car was still there past its permit time. We started the search immediately. Richard paused, his eyes lost in painful memories. We never found a thing. Not a boot, not a trace of a campsite, no signs of a struggle or an accident. She just vanished. Ramirez studied the case files on her tablet. There was a theory about a possible suicide. Richard shook his head emphatically. Proposed by a detective who never understood these mountains. If Melissa had taken her own life, we would have found her body. These mountains don't swallow people without leaving a trace. And the animal attack theory? Dismissed for the same reason. No blood, no drag marks. Richard took a sip of his now cold coffee. The thing that always bothered me was that her satellite phone never sent an emergency signal. Melissa knew how to use it. She'd activated it once before when she twisted an ankle. The detective closed her tablet and looked directly at Richard. So we have an experienced hiker who disappears without a trace. And 5 years later, her locket turns up, carefully buried with encrypted coordinates inside. She paused. What's your gut feeling, Donovan? Not as an officer, but as someone who knows these mountains. Richard held Ramirez's gaze before answering. I think someone wants us to find something, and that someone has been watching, waiting for the right moment. Why now? Why wait 5 years? That, Richard said, is the question that kept me up all night. The next morning, Richard was waiting by his all-terrain vehicle when Ramirez arrived at the rendezvous point. The sky threatened a storm and the ranger was meticulously checking his gear. Our first coordinate is in Echo Canyon, he explained as they started up a barely visible forest road. It's an area we rarely visit, too rugged for regular hikers. After a 2-hour drive and another hour of steep hiking, they reached a narrow gorge where the wind whistled constantly between the eroded rocks. We're close, Richard murmured, checking his GPS. About 50 yards north. They moved cautiously through the rock formations until they reached a small, natural clearing. Richard stopped abruptly, pointing at the ground. Someone's been here. Ramirez followed his gaze. Almost imperceptible to an untrained eye was a circle of flat stones meticulously arranged. In the center, a larger rock bore a carved symbol, a triangle with a spiral inside it. Recognize that symbol? The detective asked, photographing the find. Richard shook his head slowly. Never seen it. It's not an official trail marker or any symbol local hikers use. Wearing latex gloves, Ramirez carefully moved the central rock, revealing a small hollow beneath. She pulled out a hermetically sealed metal box, the size of a cigarette pack. They exchanged a tense look before opening it. Inside, they found a single micro SD card wrapped in protective plastic. We need to get this to the lab, Ramirez said, sealing the card in an evidence bag. Richard stared at the circle of stones, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the biting wind. Whoever did this wants us to follow a specific path. We're playing their game. You think we'll find something similar at the other coordinates? I'm sure of it. And I'm sure each piece will lead us closer to understanding what happened to Melissa. Richard looked up at the overcast sky. But I'm worried about what we'll find at the end of this path. As they made their way back down, the first drop of rain hit the dusty ground. Richard paused for a moment, watching the dark clouds gathering over the distant peaks of the Trinity Alps. Somewhere among those imposing mountains lay a truth that had been hidden for 5 years. A truth that someone finally wanted to reveal. The Alpine County Digital Forensics Lab wasn't large, but it was state-of-the-art. The specialist, Teresa Wong, her expression focused behind thick glasses, connected the micro SD card to an air-gapped computer as Richard and Detective Ramirez watched expectantly. The card is encrypted, Wong announced after several minutes. I'll need some time to access the contents without compromising the data. How much time? Ramirez asked, drumming her fingers on the metal table. A few hours, hopefully. Could it be longer? Wong adjusted her glasses. The strange thing is, it's using an old, almost obsolete encryption system. Not what I'd expect from someone with advanced knowledge. Richard frowned, as if they wanted it to be decipherable but not too easily. Exactly, Wong agreed. I'll let you know when I have something. While they waited, the teams assigned to the other coordinates began reporting similar finds. circles of stones with the same carved symbol, and small metal boxes containing identical memory cards. In the makeshift briefing room, Sheriff Bennett updated a digital map with each new confirmed location. 6 points in total, forming an irregular pattern across the park. Richard studied the map intently. It's not random. There's a purpose to this distribution. It looks like a constellation, a young officer observed, leaning over the map, like the Big Dipper. Bennett digitally connected the dots, revealing a shape that brought a momentary silence to the room. It's a perfect hexagon, Richard murmured, with a central point we haven't found yet. Ramirez's phone buzzed, interrupting the moment. After a brief conversation, she turned to the group. Wong broke through on our card, we should see it now. Back in the lab, the specialist had projected the card's contents onto a large screen. It only contains one video file, 4 minutes and 27 seconds. It's dated July 17th, 2002, the day Melissa Harrington disappeared. Richard felt his heart begin to race as Wong started the playback. The screen showed a wooded landscape filmed with a moving camera. The image was shaky, as if the person filming was walking in a hurry. There was no narration, only the mournful sigh of the wind and the sharp snap of twigs underfoot. After a minute or so, the camera stilled, focusing on a clearing between the trees where a small orange tent stood. The shot slowly zoomed in, revealing the tent's flap was partially open. "That's Melissa's tent," Richard whispered. "I recognize the patch on the corner." The camera crept closer until it showed the empty interior. An open backpack, an unrolled sleeping bag, a book lying next to a flashlight. Everything appeared orderly, with no signs of a struggle. Suddenly, the image whipped around 180 degrees, showing the forest from the perspective of someone looking out from inside the tent. For several seconds, only the motionless landscape was visible, until a blurred figure darted across the far edge of the frame. "Freeze it there," Ramirez commanded. "Go back, frame by frame." Wong complied, freezing the image at the precise moment the figure was partially visible. A dark silhouette among the trees, too distant to make out any clear features. "We can't confirm if it's human from this distance," Wong commented. "It could be a person or even a deer on the move." The playback continued. The camera left the tent, following a barely visible trail that climbed a rocky slope. Upon reaching the summit, the frame panned slowly in a 360-degree panorama, showing a rugged valley and, in the distance, a structure that Richard recognized immediately. "The old miner's abandoned cabin," he said. "It's about 3 miles off the main trail. It's not on any of the tourist maps." The video went on, the camera now approaching the cabin. Just before it reached the dilapidated door, the recording cut abruptly to black. A heavy silence filled the lab until Ramirez broke it. "Who filmed this, and why wait 5 years to show it to us? More importantly," Richard added, "where's the rest of it? This video doesn't show us what happened to Melissa." Wong was examining the file's metadata. "There's something interesting here. The original file was longer. This segment was deliberately edited to end at that exact moment." "A breadcrumb," Richard murmured. "He's leading us, step by step." Bennett, who had remained silent, turned to Wong. "How long will it take you to access the other cards? Now that I know the encryption system, it should be faster. Maybe a few hours for all of them." "In the meantime," Richard said, getting to his feet, "we should check out that cabin. It's the next logical step." Bennett nodded. "Ramirez, you go with him. Take Donovan. Bring backup and be extremely cautious. We don't know if this is a genuine lead or if someone is playing games with us." 2 hours later, Richard was navigating his all-terrain vehicle down an abandoned logging road, while Ramirez studied a digital topographical map. 2 officers followed in another vehicle. "How is it this cabin wasn't searched during the original investigation?" Ramirez asked. Richard kept his eyes on the difficult terrain as he answered. Oh, it was, but superficially. It's been derelict since the 50s when the last mine shut down. We checked it on the second day of the search and found no sign Melissa had ever been there. And now someone is pointing us directly to it? Exactly, which means either we missed something back then or someone has planted something there since. They parked the vehicles where the road became impassable and continued on foot for nearly an hour. The cabin finally appeared before them. A rickety structure of timber and stone, its roof partially collapsed and its windows like vacant eyes, empty of glass. The officers secured the perimeter while Richard and Ramirez approached the entrance with caution. The door clung to a single rusted hinge swaying slightly in the breeze. Identical to the video, Ramirez remarked, comparing the scene to a still frame on his phone. The interior was just as Richard remembered it. A main room with a crumbling fireplace, an overturned table, and the remains of what were once miners' bunks. Dust and cobwebs coated every surface, and the floor was dotted with the droppings of small animals. Doesn't look like anyone's been in here for years, Ramirez observed, sweeping his flashlight into the corners. Richard knelt, examining the dust on the floorboards. You're wrong. Someone was here about a week ago. Look at these marks. He pointed to a faint trail leading from the entrance to the fireplace. Ramirez followed it with his light, stopping at the blackened hearth, where the ashes showed signs of recent disturbance. Wearing gloves, Richard carefully brushed the ashes aside, revealing a loose flagstone at the base of the chimney. He pried it up, uncovering a hollow space beneath. Bingo, Ramirez murmured. Inside the hiding spot, they found another metal box, identical to the others but slightly larger. Upon opening it, instead of a memory card, they discovered a small field notebook with a waterproof cover and, beside it, an old wrought iron key. Richard leafed through the notebook. It was filled with geological diagrams, notes on rock formations, and what appeared to be observations on mineral veins. On the first page, neat handwriting indicated property of Melissa Harrington, field study, spring 2002. It's authentic, Richard confirmed, recognizing Melissa's characteristically meticulous drawings. But these last few pages, this isn't her writing. The final pages contained a series of entries in an angular, hurried script completely different from the rest of the journal. They seemed to be coordinates and cryptic references to the entrance, the descent, and the chamber. We need a geologist to interpret this, Ramirez said, photographing each page. Richard held up the key, examining it in the light. This is no ordinary key. It's too ornate for a simple miner's cabin. Any idea where it might fit? Possibly one of the old mine entrances, Richard replied, carefully placing the key in an evidence bag. But most of those were sealed for safety decades ago. Ramirez's phone buzzed with a message. Wong's cracked another card. It contains photographs, not video. As they walked back to the vehicles, Richard couldn't shake the feeling they were following a path meticulously laid out by someone who knew not only the mountains but also the details of the original investigation. Someone who had been watching, waiting, and was now choosing to reveal pieces of a 5-year-old puzzle. What he couldn't determine was whether they were being led to Melissa, or into an elaborate trap that was just beginning to unfold. The photographs recovered from the second memory card cast a sepulchral silence over the briefing room. There were 6 images in total, all taken in what appeared to be the interior of an abandoned mine. The quality was surprisingly high, as if captured with professional low-light equipment. The first showed a narrow entrance, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. The second, a tunnel reinforced with old yet surprisingly intact wooden beams. The third captured a fork in the tunnel, with phosphorescent chalk marks pointing in one direction. The fourth revealed a wider chamber littered with rusted mining equipment. The fifth showed a rock wall with mineral veins glittering in the light. It was the sixth image that drew gasps. A small natural cavity in the rock had been turned into what could only be described as a makeshift shelter. A thermal blanket was spread on the rocky floor. A camping lantern sat beside several aligned water bottles and, most disturbingly, one wall was covered in photographs, maps, and notes, all connected with string like the investigation board of an obsessed detective. "What the hell are we looking at?" Sheriff Bennett muttered, adjusting his glasses to get a better look. Richard pointed to several items in the final photograph. "This is an established camp. Someone has been living down there, at least temporarily." "Do you recognize this mine?" Ramirez asked. Richard nodded slowly. "I think it's the Lost Cooper mine. It was abandoned in the 40s when the ore ran out. Supposedly all its entrances were sealed in the 80s after a few accidents with amateur explorers." "Supposedly," Bennett repeated grimly. The county geologist, Dr. Esteban Mendez, who had been called in to examine Melissa's notebook, spoke up. According to these notes, Melissa had discovered an undocumented entrance. She was conducting a study on quartz formations in abandoned cave systems. He handled the notebook with care. It was an unofficial project, separate from her university research. "And the final entries?" Ramirez asked. "The ones that aren't in her handwriting." Mendez frowned. "They're instructions for navigating certain passages in the mine, warnings about unstable areas, and, this is strange, references to a central chamber that doesn't appear on any official maps." Richard slid the old key found with the notebook across the table. "And this? Any ideas?" "Older mines sometimes had security gates between sections," Mendez explained, "especially in areas where they stored explosives or in zones prone to flooding that could be sealed off in an emergency." Bennett slapped the table with determination. "We need to locate that entrance and explore the interior. Mendez, can you calculate the location based on Melissa's notes?" The geologist nodded. "With the coordinates from the notebook and these photographs, I can triangulate an approximate position. It would be in the northern sector, in a rugged area known as Devil's Gorge." Richard exchanged a meaningful look with Ramirez. That area wasn't fully explored during the original search. The terrain is too dangerous, especially after a rain. "Organize a specialized team," Bennett ordered. "I want certified cavers, a rescue team on standby, and constant communication. No one takes any unnecessary risks, understood?" The next morning, a helicopter skimmed over the jagged peaks of Devil's Gorge. Richard, along with Ramirez, Mendez, and two professional cavers from the rescue team, scanned the terrain for any sign of the hidden entrance. "There," Mendez pointed after 20 minutes of searching. "That rock formation corresponds exactly with the one described in Melissa's notes." The pilot skillfully set them down on a small ledge about 100 yards from the target. The final descent required climbing gear and all of Richard's experience in mountainous terrain. The entrance was almost invisible to the naked eye. A vertical fissure in the rock, partially covered by hardy shrubs and camouflaged by natural shadows. Only after pulling the vegetation aside did it reveal its true nature. A narrow passage clearly widened by human hands decades ago. "Incredible," Mendez murmured. "It's not in any official records. Melissa truly found something remarkable here." The team prepared meticulously: headlamps, emergency breathing apparatus, short-range communicators, and a lifeline that would keep them connected to the surface team. Richard led the way in, followed by a caver, then Ramirez, Mendez, and finally the second caver bringing up the rear. The initial passage was tight, descending at a steep angle for about 60 feet before opening into a wider tunnel that perfectly matched the second photograph. The wooden beams, though ancient, remained surprisingly solid. "This isn't just the work of miners," Mendez observed, examining the walls. "The natural geological structure was masterfully utilized. Whoever designed this knew the mountain inside and out." They moved slowly, checking the stability of each section before proceeding. When they reached the fork shown in the third photograph, they found the same phosphorescent chalk marks glowing faintly in their headlamps. Recent, the lead caver confirmed. This chalk is no more than a few weeks old. They followed the marks until they reached the wider chamber from the fourth photograph. The abandoned mining equipment cast ghostly shadows in the beams of their lights. Richard noticed something that wasn't in the image. An arrow, drawn with the same chalk, pointing toward a narrower side passage. That wasn't in the photo, Ramirez commented, comparing it to the image on his waterproof phone. Someone has been here since these pictures were taken, Richard concluded. They're actively guiding us. The side passage led them to a section where the ceiling dropped drastically, forcing them to crouch as they moved forward for several yards. When they emerged, they found themselves before a rusted metal door set into the living rock. A security door, just as I suspected, Mendez said, probably to contain flooding in the lower sections. Richard carefully produced the old key. It fit perfectly in the lock, though it took considerable force to turn the corroded mechanism. With a metallic screech that echoed through the tunnels, the gate gave way. Beyond it, they found a corridor that spiraled downward, carved directly from the rock and reinforced with masonry arches that spoke of a far more elaborate construction than the rest of the mine. "This is different," Mendez whispered. "This section was built for another purpose, not for mineral extraction." At the bottom of the spiral descent, the corridor opened into a wide and surprisingly well-preserved chamber. It was the shelter from the sixth photograph, but with one crucial difference. It was empty. The thermal blanket, the water bottles, and the makeshift investigation board were all gone. "We're too late," Ramirez said, his light sweeping across every corner. "Someone cleared this place out." Richard was examining the rock walls, noting the small holes where the photos and maps had been pinned. "Not completely." He pointed to a small crevice in the rock, barely visible. "There's something in there." Carefully, he extracted a sealed plastic envelope. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed a smiling Melissa Harrington standing next to a middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard and a serious expression. They stood at the mouth of what appeared to be the very same mine. The note, penned in the same angular script as the journal's final pages, held a brief message. "If you are reading this, Donovan, you have followed the path I laid. The truth about Melissa cannot remain buried. Search the central chamber. The answer was always there, hidden in plain sight. I will be waiting where it all began. C.L." "C.L.?" Ramirez asked. "Does that name mean anything to you?" The color drained from Richard's face. "Calvin Landry. He was Melissa's supervising professor at Stanford. He was part of the initial search party for 3 days before being called back to the university. And this photo, did you know Melissa was researching this mine with her professor?" "No," Richard admitted. The connection had never surfaced in the original investigation. Mendez, who had been examining the cavern with a professional's eye, called out to them from the far side. "There's another passage here, partially hidden by these rock formations." The passage was narrow but passable, and after about 20 meters it opened into a breathtaking natural chamber. A high-ceilinged cavern with quartz crystal formations that reflected their headlamps in a kaleidoscope of glittering colors. In the center of the chamber, resting on a natural rock platform, was a modern stainless steel case. Richard approached with caution and opened the unsecured box. It contained a tablet, sealed in a waterproof sleeve with a sticky note that simply read, "Play the only file." With the team gathered around him, Richard powered on the device. A single video file occupied the screen, After exchanging a tense glance with Ramirez, he pressed play. The bearded face of Calvin Landry filled the display. He looked gaunt, with hollow eyes and sallow skin. The date stamp in the lower corner indicated the recording was barely 3 days old. "Richard Donovan," Landry began, his voice a dry rasp. "If you are watching this, you have followed my trail of breadcrumbs to the end. I chose you specifically because you are the only one I know with the grit and the knowledge of these mountains to make it this far." He paused, running a trembling hand through his beard. "What you are about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about Melissa Harrington's disappearance. The truth has been my prison for 5 years. Now it will be your burden." The recording continued, but the image suddenly froze as a deafening roar tore through the cavern, shaking small rocks loose from the ceiling. A second, louder boom was followed by the unmistakable sound of crumbling rock. "Cave in!" one of the speleologists shouted. "We have to get out, now!" As they scrambled to pack their gear, Ramirez secured the tablet in his waterproof pack. The team raced toward the passage they'd entered, only to find it completely choked by fallen rock. "The spiral passage!" Mendez yelled. "There must be another way out through there!" With the sound of more rock collapsing behind them, they ran for the shelter chamber and up the spiraling corridor. The metal door they had opened now hung precariously from a single hinge, its frame warped by the pressure. "This isn't natural," Richard muttered as they hurried through the tunnels. "This mine has been stable for decades." "Someone triggered this deliberately," Ramirez replied. "We're being hunted." Dust choked the air as the team moved frantically through the increasingly unstable tunnels. Their headlamp beams sliced through the gloom, revealing fresh cracks spiderwebbing across the walls with each aftershock. "The fork is blocked!" shouted the lead speleologist, his light illuminating a pile of rubble where the main passage had been. "The side tunnel!" Richard directed, pointing to a narrower opening they hadn't explored. "It has to connect to an exit." With no time to deliberate, they plunged into the unknown passage, ducking to avoid menacing stalactites. The tunnel sloped downward instead of up, leading them away from the surface. "I don't like this," Ramirez muttered, glancing at the compass on his watch. "We're going deeper into the mountain." A new tremor, more violent than the last, caused a section of the ceiling to give way just behind them, sealing their path of retreat. "There's no turning back now," Richard said, his voice taut. "We push forward." The tunnel opened into an irregular chamber with 3 more passages branching off. Richard recognized the place instantly from its distinctive rock formations. "We're in the secondary tunnel network," he explained. "Miners dug these following smaller veins. If my memory serves, the right passage should eventually lead toward a ventilation shaft." "Should we try to contact the surface team?" Mendez asked, adjusting his radio. "No signal this deep," one of the speleologists replied, checking his own device. "We need to get at least 100 meters closer to the surface." They moved down the right-hand tunnel for what felt like an eternity, each step carefully placed to avoid unstable ground. The air grew progressively cooler, a sign of a connection to the outside. "Hold on," Ramirez said, suddenly stopping. "Does anyone else hear that?" Over the occasional creak of shifting rock, a rhythmic metallic sound echoed faintly down the tunnel. Tap, tap, tap. A pause. Tap, tap, tap. "Someone's tapping on the rock," Richard whispered. "It's a signal." They advanced with greater caution until the tunnel widened into another natural chamber. In the center, sitting on a flat rock beside a modern LED camping lantern, was an exhausted-looking man. His salt and pepper beard was longer and more unkempt than in the video, but it was unmistakably Calvin Landry. He stopped tapping the rock with a small pickaxe as he saw them enter. "Richard Donovan," he said, his voice hoarse. "Finally." "Professor Landry," Richard replied as the team fanned out cautiously. You have a lot to explain, starting with these cave-ins. Landry shook his head. It wasn't me. Someone else is trying to ensure the truth stays buried forever, along with us. What truth are you talking about? Ramirez interjected, identifying himself as a detective. And what does it have to do with Melissa Harrington's disappearance? Landry glanced at his watch, then toward one of the tunnels leading out of the chamber. We have very little time. The secondary charges will detonate in approximately 20 minutes. Charges? Mendez exclaimed. Are you saying someone planted explosives in the mine? Precisely. I detected the first ones when I set up my camp 3 weeks ago. I tried to disable what I could, but there are too many and they're strategically placed. Landry struggled to his feet. Follow me! The nearest exit is 10 minutes through that tunnel and I need to show you something on the way. Richard and Ramirez exchanged a look of distrust. Why should we trust you? Richard asked. You've been playing games with us, leaving breadcrumbs for weeks. Because I'm the only one who knows what really happened to Melissa, Landry answered, his intensity silencing the chamber. And because if we don't get out of here soon, we'll be joining her. With no other viable options, they followed Landry down a gradually ascending tunnel. The professor moved with the familiarity of someone who had walked the path countless times. Melissa discovered something in these mountains, he explained as they walked briskly. Something she was never meant to find. What was it? Ramirez pressed. Evidence of unauthorized excavation, a secret project disguised as abandoned mining operations. Landry paused briefly to catch his breath. Melissa didn't come here just to study geological formations. She was following discrepancies she found in historical mineral production records. What kind of secret project? Richard asked. Landry continued moving before he answered. During the Cold War, this area served as a classified research facility. They officially shut everything down in the 80s, but Melissa found evidence of continued activity. They reached a small side chamber, which Landry fully illuminated with his lamp. The walls were a collage of photographs, maps, and documents. It was the investigation board from the shelter. I moved everything here when I suspected someone had discovered my presence, he explained. Richard quickly scanned the materials. There were aerial photos dated between 1989 and 2001, showing vehicles and equipment in remote park locations, partially redacted documents on government letterhead, and detailed maps annotated with access points and exclusion zones. You're suggesting Melissa was silenced for discovering this, Ramirez said, skeptical but intrigued. Not exactly, Landry replied, pointing to a section of the board where several photos showed what looked like concealed tunnel entrances. Melissa found evidence that someone was using the tunnel network to transport something. She contacted me, excited, believing she'd uncovered a case of illegal mining or smuggling. And what did she really find? Richard asked. Landry unpinned a sealed folder from the wall and handed it to him. See for yourself. But as you do, we keep moving. Time is running out. They continued down the tunnel as Richard scanned the documents with his headlamp. They were technical reports and internal correspondence for something called Project Chimera, with dates running as late as 2002. This mentions biological containment and specimens, Richard said, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. Exactly, Landry confirmed. It wasn't a mining or military operation. It was a biological research lab, hidden literally inside the mountain. Why here? Mendez asked. It's incredibly remote and inconvenient. Precisely why, Landry answered. Natural isolation, layers of rock for shielding, and a nebulous jurisdiction between federal and state agencies. The perfect place for research they didn't want on the books. Suddenly a new tremor, stronger than the previous ones, shook the tunnel, bringing them all to a halt. That wasn't a timed charge, one of the speleologists said with alarm. The mountain itself is becoming unstable. This way, Landry urged, quickening his pace. We're close to the exit. You still haven't explained what happened to Melissa, Richard insisted, close on his heels. Melissa contacted me the day before she disappeared, Landry explained as they moved. She'd found an unmarked entrance leading to a seemingly abandoned section of the facility. She planned to explore it the next day and wanted me to know as a safety precaution. But you didn't alert anyone when she went missing, Richard accused. I did, but I didn't mention this connection, Landry admitted. I was afraid. When I joined the search, I tried to discreetly guide the team toward that area, but we could never get close enough. So why wait 5 years to reveal any of this? Ramirez demanded. Landry paused at a fork, considering for a moment before choosing the left tunnel. Because I spent 5 years investigating, gathering proof, trying to understand what Project Chimera really was. And because 6 weeks ago I received this. He showed them a small, crumpled mailer. It arrived at my office at Stanford. No return address, just my name. It contained Melissa's locket and a note that said, "Jerumia, she's still alive. Trinity knows where." The group was momentarily speechless, processing the revelation. Finally, Richard broke the silence. Are you suggesting Melissa has been held captive for 5 years? Or in hiding, Landry replied. The last entries in her field journal, which I found in her abandoned tent the day she vanished, mentioned something about contamination and quarantine protocol. The tunnel began to widen and a faint natural light filtered in from up ahead. They had found the way out. We need to report this immediately, Ramirez said, quickening her pace toward the opening. It won't be that simple, Landry warned. Whoever is behind this has enough influence to keep a Black Ops facility running for decades, and now they're cleaning house, erasing evidence and witnesses. They emerged into the daylight onto a steep, overgrown hillside. They had barely moved a few yards when a deafening explosion ripped through the mountain behind them. A cloud of dust and debris billowed from the tunnel mouth, followed by the thunderous roar of tons of rock collapsing inward. Just in time, Landry muttered, watching the entrance disappear completely under the landslide. Richard immediately keyed his radio, now functional outside. This is Donovan. We've exited a secondary opening in the northeast sector. We need immediate evac and security. I repeat, we need evac and security. While they waited for rescue, Ramirez approached Landry. This is all circumstantial, Professor. We need hard proof if we're going to proceed officially. Landry smiled for the first time, a gesture that transformed his exhausted face. I have it, Detective. Why do you think I sent you to those specific coordinates? Each location contains a backup of my findings, and there is one more, the most important one, that you haven't found yet. Richard, who had been scanning their surroundings, turned sharply to Landry. The central point of the hexagon, the 7th point I mentioned in the briefing room. Landry nodded slowly. Exactly, and that is where we will find the final answers. He paused, and perhaps Melissa. The distant thumping of an approaching helicopter cut through the air. As the aircraft appeared over the treetops, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that they were only just beginning to scratch the surface of a conspiracy far deeper than he could have ever imagined. Somewhere, nestled deep within those vast mountains, if Landry was right, Melissa Harrington was waiting to be found after 5 long years. The crisis room at the sheriff's office hummed with tense energy as Richard, Ramirez, and Landry presented their findings. Sheriff Bennett listened, his expression growing darker by the moment while technicians digitized the recovered documents and analysts began to map out connections. If all of this is true, Bennett said finally, his voice low, we're dealing with something that transcends our jurisdiction. It's true, Landry insisted, tapping a series of documents spread across the table. Project Chimera began as a legitimate military research initiative in the 70s, but it was officially shut down in 1989. What Melissa discovered is that it never really stopped. It just moved into the private sector, operating from the shadows. "What kind of research?" Bennett asked. Landry exchanged a look with Richard before answering. "Pathogens resistant to extreme conditions. They were studying microorganisms found in deep geological formations, organisms that have been isolated for millions of years." A technician analyzing the tablet recovered from the mine cut in. "Sheriff, we've managed to restore Professor Landry's full video, plus some additional files." They all gathered around a large screen as the complete recording played. The Landry on the screen picked up right where the corrupted file had cut off. "What I discovered is that Project Chimera suffered a serious containment breach in 2002, right when Melissa was conducting her research. According to the protocols I managed to obtain, anyone exposed was to be quarantined immediately. I believe Melissa stumbled into the situation by accident. Perhaps she even witnessed them taking someone away." The video Landry consulted notes off camera. "The most disturbing part is Trinity Bioresearch, the corporation that apparently continued the project. It has connections to high-level officials. I have documents suggesting they used their influence to manipulate the investigation into Melissa's disappearance." The recording ended with Landry looking directly into the camera. "The final key is at the center of the hexagon. The coordinates of each point, when processed correctly, reveal the exact location. Melissa could still be there, Richard. Find her." A heavy silence filled the room as the screen went dark. "We need those coordinates now," Bennett ordered, turning to the technicians. While the team worked, Ramirez approached Richard and Landry. "I've been digging into Trinity Bioresearch. It's a subsidiary of Nexus Global, a multinational conglomerate with substantial government contracts. Its CEO, Victor Schultz, just so happened to be on a private excursion in the Trinity Alps when Melissa disappeared. That was never mentioned in the original investigation," Richard observed, frowning. "Because it was never officially logged," Ramirez explained. "I found it in the records of a private helicopter company. They flew Schultz and a security team to an unspecified location within the park on the same day Melissa went missing." Landry nodded slowly. "It makes sense. A containment breach occurs. The highest level executives would be personally involved in containing the problem." "We've got it," a technician exclaimed from his computer station. "The center point coordinates indicate a location about 12 kilometers northeast of the mine, in an area known as Shadow Valley." A chill of recognition ran down Richard's spine. "I know that place. It's a natural depression almost completely surrounded by cliffs. There's only one access trail and it's practically impassable during the winter months. It's also technically federal land, not part of the state park," Richard added. Bennett, studying the digital map, nodded. "Which explains why it was never included in the official searches." "We need a team in there right now," Richard insisted. Bennett shook his head. "Not so fast. If we're really dealing with a Black Ops level situation, we need to be extremely cautious. And we need legitimate federal backup. We can't trust anyone at the federal level," Landry argued. "We don't know who's involved." "I know someone we can trust," Ramirez interjected. "My former supervisor in San Diego now works for the FBI's Office of Special Investigations. I can reach out to him discreetly." Bennett weighed the options before nodding. "Do it. In the meantime, let's prep a covert aerial reconnaissance." Officially, it would be nothing more than a routine wildfire inspection. 2 hours later, Richard was flying over Shadow Valley in a small forestry department helicopter, equipped with high-resolution cameras and thermal sensors. From the air, the valley looked completely uninhabited, its perimeter densely forested with a small lake at its center. "I'm not seeing anything unusual," the pilot commented as they made their third pass. Wait, Richard said, adjusting the thermal camera controls. There's something off about that lake. The thermal imaging revealed an anomaly. The water showed temperature variations that formed a pattern far too regular to be natural. It looks artificial, Richard murmured, as if there are structures beneath the surface. Back at the base, the team analyzed the captured images. Technicians applied advanced filters revealing what appeared to be an underground facility, with the lake serving as natural camouflage. Incredible, Bennett muttered. They've been operating literally right under our noses for years. Ramirez's FBI contact, Special Agent Marcus Torres, arrived by nightfall. After reviewing all the evidence, his expression turned grim. This goes far beyond a simple covert operation, he said. If these documents are authentic, we're talking about serious violations of multiple federal laws, possible unauthorized experimentation, and potential obstruction of justice in a missing persons case. Can we get a warrant? Bennett asked. Torres shook his head. Not that simple. I need to take this directly to my deputy director, someone I trust implicitly. In the meantime, I suggest maintaining constant surveillance on the valley. If there's really an active facility there, we'll see movement eventually. They could be evacuating right now, Landry warned. They know we're onto them after the incidents at the mine. I have an idea, Richard cut in. The trails into Shadow Valley are almost impossible to monitor electronically because of the topography, but I know routes that could let us set up observation points without being detected. Ramirez considered the proposal. An unauthorized recon op is risky, but it could give us the intel we need while we secure the federal warrant. I'll go, Richard offered. I know those mountains better than anyone. You're not going alone, Ramirez said firmly. I need a small, quiet team, Richard explained. 3 people max. Ramirez, you come for your tactical training, and we need someone who can identify scientific elements if we find them. I'll go, Landry offered immediately. Bennett and Torres exchanged worried glances but finally agreed to the plan. The next few hours were a blur of preparing specialized gear. Encrypted communication systems, night vision devices, and high-resolution cameras. They set out at dawn using a forestry vehicle to get as close as possible before continuing on foot. Richard led the group along barely visible trails, some that didn't even appear on official maps. I learned these paths from an old-timer ranger who worked here back in the 50s, he explained as they climbed a steep, rocky ridge. Before this area became a state park, these routes were used by local hunters. After 4 hours of strenuous hiking, they reached a high point that offered a perfect view of the valley and the lake below. We'll set up our OP here, Richard said, pointing to a rock formation that provided natural cover. They set up their equipment meticulously, powerful zoom cameras, a small solar power system, and a satellite communication device to transmit data when needed. For the first few hours, the valley seemed completely still, but as dusk began to settle, they noticed the first sign of activity. An eagle circling over the lake suddenly veered away as if it had been spooked. Something's moving down there, Ramirez murmured, adjusting his binoculars. Minutes later, the surface of the lake rippled. A circular section, about 10 feet in diameter, began to shift, revealing itself to be a camouflaged hatch. From the opening, a platform slowly emerged, carrying 2 figures dressed in what were clearly biohazard suits. Bingo, Richard whispered, capturing images with the long-range camera. It's definitely an active facility. The figures performed what looked like a routine inspection of the immediate perimeter before returning to the platform, which descended back beneath the lake's surface. We need to report this immediately, Ramirez said, preparing the satellite transmission. As they sent the images, Landry stared at the valley with a concentrated expression. There's something else, he said suddenly. Look, toward the north end of the lake. Richard trained his binoculars in the indicated direction. Barely visible among the vegetation was a low concrete structure, perfectly camouflaged to blend in with the environment. It looked like some kind of bunker or secondary entrance. That doesn't show up on any public satellite imagery, Ramirez noted, because it's specifically designed not to be seen from the air, Landry explained. It's a ground access point. Richard made a swift decision. We need to get a closer look. That could be our best chance to confirm what's really happening down there. It's too risky, Ramirez objected. We should wait for federal backup, which could take days to materialize, Richard argued. By then, they could have evacuated completely, destroyed crucial evidence. Or Melissa, if she's really there. After a tense debate, they agreed on a compromise. Richard and Landry would move close enough to get detailed images of the structure, while Ramirez would maintain the main observation post and coordinate with the team back at base. As night fell, Richard and Landry carefully descended into the valley, using the growing darkness as cover. They moved slowly, stopping frequently to scan for surveillance systems. Something doesn't feel right, Landry whispered as they neared the structure. Security seems minimal for such a sensitive installation. Maybe they're relying on natural isolation, Richard replied. Or maybe it's a trap, a voice completed from behind them. They spun around to find 3 men armed with tactical rifles emerging silently from the surrounding vegetation. They wore black, unmarked uniforms and carried advanced military gear. Richard Donovan and Calvin Landry, the leader said. You've been extremely persistent. Unfortunately, your excursion ends here. With their hands zip-tied behind their backs and blindfolds over their eyes, Richard and Landry were marched through the forest for what felt like half an hour. The sound of their captors moving with military precision was a stark contrast to the prisoners' occasional stumbles on the uneven ground. Finally, the fresh forest air gave way to a colder, more controlled environment. The echo of their footsteps suggested an enclosed, likely concrete space. The clang of a heavy metal door sliding shut confirmed they were inside some kind of facility. When the blindfolds were removed, they found themselves in a sterile interrogation room. White walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and 3 chairs. There were no windows, no visible indication of where they were except for a discreet logo on the wall, a stylized triangle with a double helix inside it, and the letters TBR beneath. Trinity Bioresearch, Landry murmured. The door opened and a man in his 60s, dressed in an impeccable gray suit, walked in. His perfectly coiffed silver hair and erect posture projected a natural authority. 2 armed guards remained at the entrance. Gentlemen, he said, his voice surprisingly affable. I am Dr. Victor Schultz. You've caused a considerable stir these past few days. Where is Melissa Harrington? Richard asked directly. Schultz offered a faint smile. Straight to the point. I appreciate that. He placed a tablet on the table and sat across from them. Before I answer any questions, I need to understand exactly what you think you know, and who else is involved. We know enough, Landry shot back. Project Chimera, the containment breach in 2002, Melissa's forced disappearance. An interesting interpretation, Schultz commented, swiping a finger across the tablet's screen. Partially correct, but fundamentally flawed in its most critical aspects. Richard held Schultz's gaze. We have all the documented proof and it's backed up. If we don't return, everything goes public. You're referring to Detective Ramirez and her little observation post, Schultz replied with an unsettling calm. We are already addressing that situation. Richard's heart hammered with worry for Ramirez, but he kept his expression a mask of stone. Allow me to clear up your misunderstanding, Schultz continued. Project Chimera was never simply about pathogen research. That was only one facet of a much broader objective: the study of extremophile organisms for their potential applications in regenerative medicine. He turned the tablet toward them, displaying microscopic images of unusual cellular structures. We discovered microorganisms in deep geological formations that possess unprecedented regenerative capabilities, organisms that remained isolated for millions of years, evolving in conditions that should be incompatible with life. "And that justifies kidnapping?" Richard asked with contempt. "There was no kidnapping," Schultz stated. "There was an accidental exposure and a voluntary quarantine." Landry leaned forward, intrigued despite their situation. "Are you saying Melissa willingly agreed to disappear for 5 years?" "Not initially," Schultz admitted. "Ms. Harrington accidentally discovered one of our secondary entrances while conducting her geological survey. Unfortunately, it coincided with a containment incident. She was exposed to an experimental culture and, following protocol, was placed under immediate quarantine." "For 5 years?" Richard asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Schultz took a deep breath before he answered. "The exposure had unexpected effects. Miss Harrington experienced physiological changes that required continuous observation and treatment. Once she understood the implications, she agreed to remain here voluntarily." "I don't believe you," Richard snapped. "I demand to see her." "That is precisely why you are here," Schultz replied, surprising them both. "Melissa has been insisting on speaking with you." Before they could process this revelation, the door opened again. A woman with brown hair pulled back in a ponytail entered slowly. She wore a white uniform similar to medical scrubs, and her face, though it looked older, more mature, was unmistakably that of Melissa Harrington. "Richard," she said with a tired smile. "Professor Landry, I'm glad you're finally here." Richard was momentarily speechless. Beside him, Landry let out a shaky breath. "Melissa, you're alive?" "More or less," she replied with a faint smile, taking a seat next to Schultz. "It's complicated. Are you okay? Are they holding you here against your will?" Richard asked, finding his voice. "Not exactly," Melissa answered, exchanging a glance with Schultz. "At first, yes, I was furious, terrified, but then, when the effects of the exposure began..." She paused, as if searching for the right words. "Show them," Schultz suggested gently. Melissa hesitated for a moment before rolling up the sleeve of her uniform, revealing her forearm. At first glance, it looked normal, but as Richard looked closer, he saw an unusual pattern beneath the skin. Tiny veins that seemed to pulse with a faint bluish light. "The exposure altered my physiology on a cellular level," Melissa explained. "My cells began to incorporate properties from the microorganisms. At first, it was terrifying. Intense fevers, debilitating pain, but afterward, I started to change in ways no one had anticipated." "What kind of changes?" Landry asked, his scientific curiosity clearly ignited. "Accelerated regeneration for a start," she said. "My cells repair themselves at an unprecedented rate. Cuts that should take days to heal are gone in hours. But there are side effects. My metabolism is extremely unstable, my body temperature fluctuates drastically, and my sleep patterns are practically non-existent." "That's why she couldn't simply return to her old life," Schultz added. "Her condition requires constant monitoring and a controlled environment." Richard stared at Melissa, searching her face for any sign of coercion or manipulation. "And you expect us to believe you've stayed here voluntarily for 5 years without contacting your family or friends?" Melissa held his gaze. "It wasn't voluntary at first, that's true. But in time, Richard, what's happening inside of me could revolutionize medicine. We're talking about potential cures for degenerative diseases, breakthroughs in tissue regeneration, even potential treatments for cancer." "At the cost of your freedom?" Richard asked. At the cost of my normality, she corrected him. The truth is, I can't lead a normal life anymore. My condition makes it impossible. At least here, my situation has a purpose. Landry, who had been lost in thought, spoke up. If all of this is true, why the extreme secrecy? Why not make this research public? Politics, economics, fear, Schultz answered. Imagine the implications of a treatment that could potentially eliminate diseases that generate billions in pharmaceutical revenue. Imagine the panic if it were known that we're studying organisms that can rewrite human DNA. Then who sent the locket? Richard demanded. Who left all those clues? Melissa and Schultz shared a meaningful look before she answered. I did, with some help from inside. The facility is divided, Schultz explained. There are factions. Some of us believe the time has come to release our research under the proper protocols. Others insist on maintaining absolute secrecy. My condition has stabilized enough to consider a controlled return, Melissa continued. I needed someone I could trust, someone who would understand the complexity of the situation, and I needed the research to be uncovered by legitimate external sources, not leaked from within. So this was all an elaborate plan to get us to find this place? Richard asked, his voice laced with disbelief. To get the right people to find it, Melissa corrected. People who wouldn't be easily silenced or discredited. The situation is extremely delicate, Schultz added. There are powerful interests who would rather see this entire facility destroyed than have its research revealed. Others would want to weaponize it. Richard was struggling to process it all. And Ramirez? You said you were taking care of her. Is she being escorted here right now? She is, Schultz confirmed. Along with Agent Torres, we need your cooperation, not your antagonism. So what happens now? Landry asked. A proposal, said Schultz. We are preparing a controlled disclosure protocol, full documentation of our research, independent ethical oversight, and a gradual program to introduce our findings to the scientific community. And we need your help, Melissa added. Richard, you understand these mountains and the local community. Professor Landry, your academic credibility is impeccable. You would both be ideal intermediaries between us and the outside world. And if we refuse? Richard challenged. Then you will be released with a non-disclosure agreement, Schultz replied smoothly. Though I sincerely hope you won't choose that path. What we have here could fundamentally change human medicine forever. The door opened again and Detective Ramirez entered. She was escorted but not physically restrained. She looked unharmed but was clearly tense. Richard, she said, relief washing over her face when she saw him. Are you all right? Apparently we're being offered a job, Richard replied with barely contained sarcasm. Ramirez looked at Melissa in astonishment. Melissa Harrington, you look exactly like your photographs. One of the side effects, Melissa explained with a sad smile. Significantly reduced cellular aging. Schultz stood up. I suggest we continue this conversation in a more comfortable setting. Melissa, why don't you show them the facility? I think you'll better understand our situation when you see the full scope of our work. As they followed Melissa out of the interrogation room, Richard moved closer to her and asked in a low voice, Are you really here of your own free will? Melissa looked him directly in the eye. The truth is complicated, Richard. I can't leave because of my condition, but I have found a purpose in my confinement. She paused. But there are things happening here that Schultz doesn't fully control, things that need to come to light. Before Richard could ask more, they arrived at an elevator that began to descend deep beneath the lake's surface. Through the elevator's transparent walls, they glimpsed a massive underwater installation spreading out in every direction. Welcome, Melissa said as the doors opened onto a new world hidden beneath the tranquil waters of the Trinity Alps, to the real Project Chimera. The elevator opened into a spacious underwater lobby. Through enormous reinforced glass panels, they could see the dark waters of the lake, punctuated by the occasional silver flash of a curious fish. The facility was a marvel of modern engineering. Polished steel, transparent glass, and ambient lighting created an almost ethereal atmosphere. The main facility extends about 80 meters below the lake's surface, Melissa explained as she led them down a main corridor. It was originally built in the 70s as a government contingency bunker, but was repurposed for scientific research in the 80s. Along the corridor, scientists and technicians in white lab coats worked in various laboratories, all visible through glass walls. A few glanced up as the group passed, as if guided tours were a common occurrence. We currently have about 120 personnel working here across 3 shifts, Melissa continued. Molecular biologists, geneticists, medical specialists, engineers, all of this completely off the grid? Ramirez asked, clearly impressed by the scale of the operation. Not exactly, Melissa replied. On paper, this is a private hydrogeological research center. The top level of the facility conducts legitimate research on aquatic ecosystems, which is published regularly. The classified work happens on the lower levels. They stopped in front of a security door where Melissa placed her hand on a biometric scanner. The door slid open silently, revealing a laboratory that was larger and more advanced than the others. "This is my workspace," she said with a hint of pride in her voice, "and essentially where I live." The lab was a hybrid space combining state-of-the-art scientific equipment with a surprisingly comfortable living area in one corner. A small lounge with sofas, a compact kitchen, and what looked like a bedroom separated by a frosted glass partition. In the center of the lab stood a medical station reminiscent of an ICU, with advanced monitors and diagnostic equipment. On the walls, digital screens displayed DNA sequences, cellular activity graphs, and what appeared to be simulations of biological processes. "This is where we monitor my condition and develop potential applications," Melissa explained. "My blood now contains roughly 15 million symbiotic microorganism units per milliliter. They've integrated with my cells, creating a unique hybrid system." "Is it contagious?" Landry asked, instinctively keeping his distance. Melissa shook her head. "Not in its current form. The organisms require a specific vector for the initial transfer and only integrate under precise conditions." She pointed to a series of sealed containers in a corner of the lab. "Those are the original cultures isolated from geological formations over 2 kilometers deep." Richard watched her closely. Though she spoke with the passion of a dedicated scientist, he noticed subtle signs of tension in her body language. "What's the end goal of all this?" he finally asked. Melissa exchanged a look with Landry before answering. Originally, the project sought military applications. Soldiers with accelerated regenerative abilities, pathogen resistance, adaptability to extreme environments, but the effects proved impossible to control with any precision. "So they pivoted to medical applications," Landry said, beginning to understand. "Exactly," Melissa confirmed. "Imagine treatments that could regenerate nerve tissue in spinal injury patients, or therapies that target and eliminate cancer cells with surgical precision. The potential is revolutionary." "But there are complications," Richard observed, noticing how she avoided certain details. Melissa nodded slowly. "The effects vary dramatically between individuals, and the integration process is extremely traumatic for the human system. Most of the test subjects didn't survive the initial stages." "Test subjects?" Ramirez asked sharply. "Are you saying you've been experimenting on people?" "Terminal volunteers at first," Melissa answered, her voice quieter now. "People with end-stage diseases who had no other options, but yes, there have been human trials." She walked to a console and activated a large screen on the wall. Images of patients in various stages of treatment appeared. Some showed miraculous improvement from seemingly incurable conditions. Others showed horrifying complications, tissue mutations, accelerated neurological decay. Of the 23 initial subjects, only 3 of us survived with stable integration, Melissa explained. And I am the only one who maintains fully intact cognitive functions. A heavy silence fell over the room as they processed the implications. Why send the Locket now? Richard finally asked. Why after 5 years? Melissa switched off the screen and walked to a window overlooking the dark lake. Because the project's direction is changing. Again. She turned to face them. Schultz and his faction want to proceed with limited commercial applications, starting with basic regenerative treatments. But there's another faction, led by a Dr. Lawrence Mercer, who has secured military contracts again. Weaponization? Landry asked, his voice filled with concern. Melissa nodded. Mercer has developed a delivery vector that allows for a more controllable partial integration. It's not as potent as my condition, but it's enough to create significant tactical advantages. Super soldiers, Ramirez murmured. In essence, yes, and he's gaining influence with the investors. Melissa looked at them intently. I needed outside allies before that could happen. People who could independently verify what's happening here and ensure this technology is used to heal, not to harm. Richard finally understood. You didn't just want to be found. You wanted to expose the entire project, but in a controlled way. Exactly, Melissa confirmed. A sudden total revelation would cause panic, immediate military intervention, and probably the destruction of research that could save millions of lives. Before they could continue, the lab door slid open and Dr. Schultz entered, accompanied by a younger man with a severe expression. I see Melissa is showing you our work, Schultz said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. This is Dr. Lawrence Mercer, our Director of Advanced Applications. Mercer gave a curt nod. Dr. Schultz, the board requests your presence immediately. There's been a development. As Schultz hurried out, Mercer remained, observing the group with calculated interest. So, you're the persistent investigators who've been causing such a stir. His gaze settled on Melissa. An interesting strategy, Melissa. A rather risky one. It was necessary, Lawrence, she replied firmly. You know I can't support the direction you're promoting. It's called progress, Melissa. Progress. Mercer smiled coldly. I suggest you all enjoy your tour. The next few hours are going to be decisive. When Mercer had gone, Melissa waited for the door to close completely before speaking. Her voice barely a whisper. We don't have much time. The board is voting on Mercer's military contract today. If it's approved, all civilian regenerative research will be subordinated to military applications. What can we do? Landry asked. I have everything documented, Melissa said, moving quickly to a hidden panel in the wall. She removed a digital storage unit the size of a small book. 5 years of data, experiments, results, potential applications, ethical risks. It's all here. And what are we supposed to do with this? Ramirez asked. Get him out of here and to the proper authorities, Melissa replied. Agent Torres can help, but we have to move now. A sharp, piercing sound cut her words short. Security alarms blared through the facility as the lights shifted to a pulsing crimson hue. Too late, Melissa muttered. They fast-tracked the vote. Mercer must have gotten his approval. The lab's monitors flickered to life, displaying security feeds from all over the installation. On one, they saw Schultz being led away by armed guards. On another, security teams moved with methodical precision, sealing off sections of the complex. Transition protocol, Melissa explained, her voice urgent. Whenever there's a significant change in project leadership, they lock down the facility first and neutralize any potential internal dissent. Neutralize? Richard asked, his voice tight. Temporary detention for the most part, but Mercer isn't known for his subtlety. Melissa's fingers flew across her console. I have a contingency. I've been preparing for this for months. The lab lights flickered once, then stabilized. A section of the wall slid away with a soft hiss, revealing a hidden passage. A maintenance tunnel, she explained. It leads to an emergency exit on the north shore of the lake. It's our only way out now. Are you coming with us? Richard asked. Melissa hesitated, a flicker of pain in her eyes. My condition requires constant monitoring, specialized equipment. I wouldn't survive long out there. But if you stay, Landry began. Mercer needs me alive, she answered with bitter resolve. I'm the only fully stable subject. His research would be set back years without my regular samples. On the monitors, they could see security teams closing in on their location. There's no time to argue, Melissa insisted, pressing a storage drive into Richard's hand. This information has to get to the outside world. It's the only way to ensure this technology is used to heal, not to destroy. Richard took the drive but gripped Melissa's arm. We will come back for you, I promise. Melissa offered a sad smile. I know. She turned to Landry. Professor, there's an experimental treatment in development. It could stabilize my condition enough to exist outside this facility. It's documented in the archives under Project Phoenix. If you can expose all this, it might be my only chance at real freedom. They moved toward the hidden passage just as the lab doors began to groan open. Melissa shoved them into the tunnel. I'll seal the entrance behind you. Melissa, Richard started. 5 years, Richard, she interrupted, her voice filled with intensity. I have waited 5 years for the truth to come out. Don't ruin it now. As they scrambled into the narrow tunnel, they heard Mercer's voice from the lab, muffled by the closing wall. Dr. Harrington, you are relieved of your current duties. The tunnel was cramped and dimly lit by emergency strobes. They moved as fast as they could, following its slight upward incline. Do you think she'll be all right? Ramirez asked between breaths. Mercer won't permanently harm her, Landry replied. She's too scientifically valuable. But it's not just science for her, Richard added. It's her life. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel ended at a circular hatch. Richard forced it open, revealing a small shed camouflaged among the vegetation on the lake's north shore. They emerged into the morning light, gasping in the fresh air after the sterile environment of the underground facility. In the distance, the imposing peaks of the Trinity Alps stood, seemingly unmoved by the secrets they concealed. Now what? Ramirez asked, looking at the storage drive in Richard's hand. Richard stared at the device that held 5 years of revolutionary scientific secrets, Melissa's testimony, and potentially the future of human medicine. Now, he said with grim determination, we make sure the truth sees the light of day, and then we go back for Melissa. As they moved away from the lake, Richard glanced back one last time. Beneath those calm waters, Melissa Harrington continued her extraordinary existence, trapped between worlds, waiting for the truth to finally rise to the surface, just as she hoped to one day. Somewhere above the mountains, a lone eagle circled in the clear sky, free and watchful, a symbol of the hope they now carried, a promise that even the most deeply buried secrets would eventually find their way to the light.